So I am Gigi Shafai. I'm the co-chair of the Life Science Forum, as Jim mentioned, and doctorate in pharmacy. So I'm the curious scientific lens that have the pleasure of being the moderator for today's second panel. Interestingly, after a decade of working in the molecule space in chronic and rare disease across a variety of staged companies, I pivoted to pair therapeutics. So I also work there in the digital therapeutics, prescription digital therapeutic space. So I really, from the last panel, just hearing the dynamic of both approaches and what all the tools are that are out there. Now I'm going to switch to the scientific curiosity behind things and speak with, I have the pleasure of introducing Brian Bronk, Jeff Elton, and Shiva Dustar in this panel on advancing next generation innovation and what it actually really means. So we use this term innovation. It's pretty vague. And what does it actually mean? Well, people look at innovation and it varies from discipline to discipline. So the beauty is actually in the eyes of the beholder. So when you say what is innovation, it's a loaded term. But we have three great beholders here. So Brian Bronk, who is Sanofi's head of business development for MS, neurology, rare disease, rare blood, and innovative technologies, which is loaded in itself, but comes back with scientific roots in R&D, and then moved into the BD space. Jeff Elton, CEO of ConcertAI. So he's coming at it from, he's a MassBio board member, author, former McKinsey and Accenture, and coming at it from a digital lens. And then Shiva Dustar, who's joining us from Europe, who is the director and head of the European Investment Bank Institute and the first woman to lead this key pillar of the EIB. Go women and go, and she comes from a background from 28 years, if you're not familiar with Shiva from the financial industry, but she's spent time across sectors. So I think we can learn some cross-sector perspective from Shiva. So I will be starting off with you, Brian. So you're the beholder from the large pharma perspective, and paint a picture for us today, please. How are you thinking about innovation now? What does it mean to you? What lights you up? And how do you approach the term innovation?
Yeah, and thanks, Gigi, for the introduction, and for everyone who's participating today, and the rest of the panel here. I'm looking forward to the conversation. It's context dependent. You've captured it nicely. At the end of the day, it's about the patient. And so at Sanofi, when we invoke the word innovation, it is how are we going to bring therapeutics to patients faster, to make those therapeutics better? How do we work in the development arena to find the patients? There was a little bit of a conversation on that in the previous panel, and really start to segment diseases that are human biology can still be very heterogeneous. I have the luxury of being involved in rare diseases. Those are monogenic disorders most typically. But a lot of human biology and a lot of diseases are still very, very heterogeneous. So how do we apply innovation to really bring those precision medicines to patients faster and with just a medically meaningful differentiation? So there's a lot in there, and it can be very early stage. The number of modalities that are continually emerging, it's just fascinating. But for the sake of what? How do they distinguish themselves from each other is a very important question. So we place a high bar at Sanofi on what does it mean to be innovative, and not just in partnerships. We apply the same high bar internally. Ultimately, it's about the patients. The pipeline that we need to build has to differentiate for the medical community, not just based on a scientific differentiation.
Great, thank you. So Shiva, you're coming at it from a unique background from EU, from investment bank, and Jeff, you're coming at it from the digital lens. So Jeff, I'd say because of the last conversation around the digital innovation,
Yeah.
can you just give us a flavor what innovation means from your lens, and give a flavor to all those that might not know across the life cycle all the different words for digital innovation, if you will.
Yeah, thanks, Gigi. And I was super pleased to hear the concepts of digital emerge so much, particularly in the investing session. But I may actually pick up on a couple words that Brian said. So I think the centering of it's about the patient, and it's about advancing needed medical innovations more rapidly. So if we actually kind of start connecting those dots, you actually kind of say it's not just about doing something that's differentiated or something that may not have been seen before, because undifferentiated and things that weren't seen before may not matter. It's actually about focusing on those things that actually have materiality to actually moving biomedical innovations through more rapidly, more confidently, more successfully. That can be about time, it could be about precision, and it could have different dimensions to it. And I actually think, you know, the investor, having them in the order, the sequence you went through this, so that you've got that lens about how, yes, capital access is harder, but capital access is still there. Where capital will flow and where collaborations will flow actually are probably a lot more purposeful rather than just doing a proof of concept in that particular area. So that actually starts shaping how you think about where innovations are. So discovery is difficult. That's why AI, machine learning, multimodal data sets are coming together in discovery, because if I can find patterns that extend beyond the literature, but those actually then can provide some insights that are actionable, which certain data science and AI, ML approaches will enable you to do, that's high value. That enables me to do things that might have taken years of pathway biological mapping, interrogations, and kind of things of that nature. Same thing if I'm actually planning clinical trials, and Brian made a reference to this, finding patients in workflows are hard for a few reasons. One is clinical teams and providers and research sites, they don't have a lot of time. And COVID-19 reduced their staffing even more. So this notion that I could have technology and intelligence augmentation, but adjacent and integral to that workflow. So it's not logging in, logging out. It's not adding more complexity, doing it mindfully. That's very high value. If I can actually run a study and power a study and do a study and actually get it done in 30 to 40% of the time, but actually have more confidence in the results and the outcome presented to the regulators, that's super high powerful all the way over. If I'm in a provider setting, we talk a lot about digital tools in 510K and software as a medical device, but if I can find the highest responding patient and actually use maybe a medical device biomarker that can complement and kind of the therapeutic entity, that may actually function in those workflows to allow those patients to be identified more confidently. And that's better for the provider, that's better for the biopharma innovator. So those are some of the areas where we're actually seeing a lot of attention, a lot of focus at the moment.
Thanks so much, Jeff. So Shiva, is there innovation at the investor level? What's innovation from your lens?
Yes, absolutely. And greetings here from Luxembourg. I'm glad that we bring some European perspective from Europe to this panel. And it was a fascinating discussion to listen earlier, especially the latter part of the panel earlier. So in terms of innovation, for the EIB, the Bank of the European Union, we clearly need to innovate our financing products, our financial products, in order to actually be able to support innovation, to finance innovation. And that's actually really been quite critical in the life science space. It's a very important part of our investment portfolio, roughly 2.5 billion in the biotech, medtech space. And if you look at it, we had to innovate. So if, we had to, for instance, already in 2015, around the Ebola crisis, we realized infectious diseases are not getting their fair share of financing. The grants are not sufficient. We don't get TB vaccines or all sorts of vaccines in the market. It's a bit strange to talk about it now, but given COVID and what we've realized that, the economic costs associated with not having vaccines, but this was what triggered us to set up the infectious diseases finance facility, which was effectively a blended instrument, risk sharing between the European Commission and the EIB, in order to actually come into a space, instead of just putting grants, think of it as a repayable grant or a forgivable debt type mechanism to come in where actually the banks would not come in. But with that, bring some financial discipline and some upside, in particular upside in case of a success, that these monies flow back and enable basically the European Union, the EIB, to put more money to work. So a smart way of actually supporting it. This was on the sort of, I guess, the infectious disease front, but we also realized that the venture capital market, or the VC instrument, may not really always be fit for purpose when it comes to these long R&D investment needs, high risk. And hence, we also, improved our venture debt. We call the venture debt product. It's not like the US, perhaps, venture debt. It is more patient capital, less dilutive, that actually can it's beautifully combined with VC money. So around the C round, Series C, we would come in with the venture debt, typically as with a bullet repayment with paid in kind features, basically quasi equity instrument. But we've realized that we had to have that type of instrument to kind of fill the gap for some of these biotechs. And that's actually been a very important part of our portfolio. We've had over 1.5 billion in 48 type of projects, you benefiting from that venture debt. And then finally, I would just want to say that on the VC side, we have our EIF, the European Investment Fund, and there they also had to innovate, or they had to be responsive, respond to the needs of the new types of VC funds. But I can discuss that a bit later.
Thank you. So I'm going to come back to you, Brian, because out of scientific curiosity now, what are the hot topics or diseases or new technologies that are shaking up the investment pot? Because you see a lot of assets come on your plate. You've been to industry conferences, and you have a pulse across rare, innovative technologies and blood disorders. So, I mean, what's hot?
Yeah, so if taking a step back and nobody can do everything. So, at Sanofi, we have our pharma business and we have a vaccines business. And within pharma, we've even defined immunology, oncology, rare diseases, neurology. So we have to have a discipline going into our analyses and where are the areas that we can really bring value medically. And so there's a strategy that's defined. We stay focused, but we're not myopic. So we can't keep our eyes so specifically on a very defined list of targets, because innovation will catch our attention, and we need to be adaptive to that. I think what is when you look across the areas, what are the common themes where innovation is catching our attention? The explosion of biology insights is really powerful. We're in an era now of target identification, target validation that is occurring faster than we have seen before. I mentioned before that the modalities are increasing. And what does that mean? Well, it means we can deliver therapeutic payloads very selectively to where they need to be, probably going after targets that historically were the legacy undruggable term. So there's certainly a lot of activity that catches our attention in those arenas. And one of the most fascinating aspects of this industry is we are one of the very few where innovation collides with regulation. So, we can get excited about all of these activities, and at the same time, there are regulatory authorities that are going to be, very watchful over how we're bringing them forward. And so, that's another place where we're always looking ahead and saying, where can we anticipate where these innovations will need a little bit of extra time with regulatory authorities as we bring them forward. So hopefully that it starts to answer the question for you.
Absolutely. I think one of the things that there's a lot in just the rare disease arm. There's ultra rare, there's specific disease areas that there's more focus on. And then there's the chronic broad diseases that may be targeted by these target validations that you're mentioning. So how do you, you said that the team is more is focused, but not myopic. But even within all of the areas that you're looking at, are there certain therapeutic areas that you've, like maybe 4 years ago, I think at Panorama, we had one of the world's leading experts on the microbiome. You see spikes in different areas, right? And so right now, would you say one or two areas from a rare disease standpoint, or not necessarily Sanofi, right? But just when you hear and you go to conferences, what do you see more of?
Certainly. I mean, and if I can put the lens on of the rare disease space to exemplify, we talked about it in the previous session. It's the genomic medicines, gene therapy, and the role that those can play in bringing what we all aspire to do, which is curative approaches to diseases. I mean, so that is certainly in rare diseases and rare neurological disorders a place where we definitely see a lot of activity. I mean, that I think that's a great example, and how that moves forward. And it is quite innovative. A lot still to accomplish there, both from a regulatory perspective and then also the payer's perspective. These are challenging to figure out how the medical impact is so large, but how do we convince or work with payers to make sure that is recognized appropriately over time?
Thanks so much. Just to piggyback off of that, and then I'll switch to you, Jeff, in a moment. But are there any factors that play a role when considering and investing in a new product or technology that have sort of evolved in the past 3 years? Like, you've been in BD for a while now, but are you seeing some sort of shift in the approach generally from large pharmas in the way that you analyze and evaluate assets?
Yeah, it's a great question. We had a chance to talk about that a little bit in the prep meeting. I think I mean, there's two things. There's when we look at the economy and the opportunities that sit in front of pharma today versus 2 years ago, it's night and day. 2 years ago, pharma wasn't losing deals to other pharma. Pharma was losing deals to IPOs. And that lure of going public was very, very strong. I think, unfortunately, now there's a sort of a cycle back the other way, where many of those companies are now trying to figure out how to extend a cash runway so that their innovative science has enough time to mature, and we can all see that, and the value to patients comes. So a major shift in what is what the environment looks like now versus, say, 2 years ago. I'm borrowing a quote from someone else, in 2020 and 2021, we had investors that got involved who were quote unquote tourists in our industry. A lot of money came pouring in, and the long-term nature of these investments may not have been fully appreciated. The question you asked was, how do we value these? It's so much stage dependent. So we will look at full-on valuation models. We certainly do that for later stage programs, where it's very clear what the therapeutic is. The earlier we go in the innovation cycle in the value chain, the harder that is for that to be meaningful. So we blend that a lot with what's the cost to get to the next value inflection point? What's the amount at risk to really get to the answer on, is this differentiated? Is this medically differentiated? So it depends is the answer, but those are the types of tools that we'll look at, the types of analyses.
Thanks so much, Brian. So Jeff, again, coming back to the digital lens, are there any new technology innovations that might have an easier time raising capital? And, I want to figure out how in a pandemic scenario, you were able to raise 150, million during a pandemic year, and just give us some flavor into the digital or technologies and the approach or best practices or areas that might have an easier time.
Yeah, I don't know if you would always say we have the best timing when you say we're skirting around pandemics and market collapses and tanks rolling across country borders, but with all those to the side a little bit. So one theme we kind of try to practice is to kind of think with three different lenses at the same time. So think like an operator, think like an investor, and actually think like your customers, because I think in many respects, we're kind of, we have different interests that we're trying to put together. Our job as a company is to kind of try to build a highly innovative, durable operating company. So right now, I can tell you when I'll be cash flow positive and profitable in each one of my particular lines of business. And that's a very difficult thing for most digital companies. A lot of the approaches we took was to not ask investors to fund things when it wasn't clear they were going to work. And so we actually do collaborative models with a lot of biopharma sponsors and other things first. And we actually try to have a very clear process for vetting things out and actually do that process before we actually seek to get outside investment to kind of underwrite that. So it's a different way of kind of, proving viability of because I think by working with the customer as opposed to just doing our own internal innovations and proof of concept, you have a different bar, different set of lenses, different evidence of potential utility in something that you're trying to bring in doing that. Even now, when we bring on and augment our own products, we have a very formalized incubation process that actually requires interacting with 5 downstream customers as potential beneficiaries of that, or we don't continue to make our own internal investment around some of those kinds of areas. So I think one is, I think digital companies are going to do just fine. I mean, quite frankly, my space, because most of them, as you went through the pandemic, there was a lot of washout of a lot of companies. It was a crucible that actually forced you to show that you could work remotely, and it forced you could show in a purely digital world without actually human supplementation of those particular initiatives. And a lot of things didn't work, actually. And so that's actually good because we now know things that actually do work and we can scale up. We know things that work sort of, but maybe patients didn't actually like them, but maybe in complement with the providers, we can deploy things in different ways. And I think that kind of knowledge probably would have taken us a decade to actually have kind of collected, but we actually got it in a much shorter period of time. And actually, I think that's actually being very positive. I think if you're looking at, I don't know a company right now that's not deploying data science teams as part of their discovery operations and trying to kind of integrate AI machine learning with alternative sources of data to crack the back of really difficult problems. I'm not aware. most major pharma, biopharma have digital initiatives to completely transform how they're going to conduct their clinical research and clinical trial activities. Again, that may have taken more than a decade if we wouldn't have had some of these crucible moments to kind of come together. But those are guides to kind of where one could, in fact, begin to innovate. You know, we would do work in the provider, and we now have an open AI architecture for AI and machine learning being deployed for clinical diagnosis, interpretation of imaging that can also be used for clinical trial activities. And that's doing very well, Europe, United States, and Japan. And so there's a high openness to those sources of innovation that you bring forward. So I think a lot of this is actually how you bring the right lenses to bear of where you're going to kind of choose to deploy. And then that also will be your guide to where you're going to be raising capital and how you're going to do it and what that journey might look like. So.
Thanks so much. And Brian, just to piggyback real quick, so the Sanofi does that right across the life cycle, because we had a panel 2 years ago, I think it was, on digitizing clinical trials and advancing clinical trials, and someone from Sanofi shared that experience. How about in BD? Do you use like digital AI, these kinds of things, or
I mean, so you have to be cautious about confidentiality. Yeah. The tricks of our trade. So you are right that we use it across the entire value chain, and I do think one of the places that we a lot of activity in research for sure. In clinical development, I think we are on the cusp of really figuring out how to do the digital twins and how to run those clinical trials much faster, much more efficiently. We all want to be in a position where we can say to a patient, we truly believe this medicine is going to help you. Come join our clinical trial. And, you know, unfortunately, that means that there will be other conversations where it's, this is one we don't think is going to be beneficial to you. Even in BD, yes, we do apply a variety of tools that just help us with our assessment, our analyses. You know, some of them are available to many, and then we do have a few tricks of the trade that we apply internally.
Thank you. So Shiva, tell me about, we had an interesting conversation about debt-like equity features, and I would love to probe a little bit around your efforts coming at it across sectors. First off, are we doing well in healthcare as compared to other sectors like tech, green? I've seen you all over the globe with various sectors presenting. And when you think of scientific innovation and investment from this lens that you're wearing, are we doing all right in healthcare here?
Well, I think, you know, this is always a tricky question, and there's obviously a geographical issue potentially because of the way the US, maybe potentially the deep VC market in the US versus the perhaps more fragmented European market. I would say we tried to address this question in 2018. I mean, this feels now like centuries ago, but this was actually a report, and, you know, there will be I don't know whether you can see it. No, actually the way it is with the thing. Anyway, there will be hopefully
in the metaverse. It's in the metaverse.
We actually try to tackle that issue, and in that report, which is on our website, you know, is the financing the next wave of medical breakthroughs. We were looking from an EU perspective. Are the financing instruments that we have in place fit for purpose? Are they catalytic enough to actually bring enough private capital into early stage, all the way from seed to across basically to the end game? And what we found in that study is that indeed, there is not enough risk capital, that the VC, at least in Europe, the VC market is not patient enough, so to speak, and that actually really has been quite interesting to now see in Europe. We now see actually growth biotech funds like JATO, and I believe Sanofi even also has invested in JATO. So Brian can even give maybe a different perspective on his side, but our subsidiary, the European Investment Fund, has also been an LP, a large LP in this fund. And what is really interesting with that particular fund, it very much validated what our study recommended, meaning instead of having sort of early stage VC funds, then mid stage and late stage, having actually big enough biotech funds that come in early and stick longer, having enough also capital that they can put in place so that, with an end game in mind for these companies, so that these companies actually can really both grow organically or do buyouts, but really have that additional space. And this is also so that we have supported as an LP in JATO, which had a first fund raise around, which is of over 500 million euros. But more importantly, with our debt products, we are trying to then do co-investment facilities to provide that venture debt to the portfolio companies, to basically give them additional patient capital, because I think that is ultimately what we have seen missing in Europe. There are these valleys of death, and if you don't actually provide that capital, as earlier was suggested, these companies may actually move away from Europe because capital is more easily available. And we would, certainly from an EU policy perspective, our bank is trying to make it as attractive as possible for them to stay in Europe. So it's a combination of supporting the VC funds with, that are sort of taking that multi-stage approach, and ensuring that then we complement that with debt instruments that have also that level of risk capacity to come in and extend the bandwidth of the capital. Now, in a high rise, I should maybe say we are indeed looking at an investment environment of higher interest rates, higher cost of capital. And this is where banks like the EIB, as a rainy weather contrarian, I don't want to say necessarily lend of last resort, but we have seen that happen in 2008, 2009, that all of a sudden the role of of a public sector bank in Europe becomes very critical in order to continue to support, important sectors like the biotech sector.
That's wonderful. And Brian, any comments on that? Because you had that commonality with the approach, and there's also the Sanofi Ventures arm, and then the philanthropy side of things, because I also hear about pharmas that, so you split the BD and the R&D, and then there's the venture side of things. So maybe you could shed light on that.
Yeah, I mean and indeed we have been working with JATO, and it's the theme that cuts across all of them is a common thesis for what we're here to do, and whether it's our ventures team or the BD team or our internal R&D, it is truly about serving those patients, and really. I keep coming back to it, but that's why I've been in the industry for 30 years. That's what we're here to do. It's really hard. When we get it right, it's profound. And you mentioned some of the philanthropic aspects. We have a conviction to bring our medications to patients across the globe, and so when we need, there are ways that we can do that. I think as an industry, you just have to look at the response to COVID and see how, as an industry, that the willingness to make sure that therapies are available to patients as fast as possible. But across all of the activities that we have within Sanofi, it really is that common long-term mindset that this is about bringing medicine to patients. There are difficult days in that, and the true reward is not getting through a phase of clinical development. That's important, but truly the end of it is when patients are benefiting from what we bring forward.
Thank you. So Jeff, we're hearing a lot about how digital health is positioned a lot to address health equity and access to care, and there's this side of the treatment side of things, and also informing and identifying the patients for those trials. So there's sort of the before, during the trial process, and then after. So what are your thoughts on all this? And it kind of goes back to your original comment around the solving those gaps and complementing and really holistically getting at the right patients, which we're all here to serve.
Yeah, so I'm super pleased that you added that question, because I think notions of trial diversity and health equity are actually they're a big deal. I mean, it's a societal thing, but it's also an FDA and EMEA and regulatory imperative to actually make sure that if you've got racial, ethnic, and sometimes even economic subpopulations that may be disproportionately negatively affected by a disease, that you actually make sure they're represented in trial data. And there are a lot of populations that do get excluded from trials. Sometimes, I mean, we know that, you know, most trials exclude the morbidly obese, most trials exclude people with severe organ impairment. But I think part of the job of actually studies is to be as representative as possible of the ultimate populations that should in fact be receiving the drugs. Your question also underneath it, because we're a company that sees lots of data. So, you know, we're in oncology, hematology, and we probably see 30% of the populations that are kind of treated and impacted by this. Sometimes there's even there may be a bias in the data that was historically used because of non-participation of some of those particular groups. So there's really, you know, this is where I think a lot of the digital companies can make a lot of progress, because one, you can actually assure that the data and the solutions you're using and the models you're building start off actually as representative. And that's something that we now have the tools and the infrastructure to do. Quite frankly, the pandemic, if there's a gift that we get out of it, it was this ability to confederate vast amounts of data much more quickly and much more collaboratively than we ever could before to take a look at some of these things. I think the second part is, if I'm using tools to go look for patients in the workflow of the provider, these are much lighter weight pieces of infrastructure that use what's called edge technologies, and I can deploy them locally inside the firewall, close to the PHI or even European, you know, be European privacy compliant and do it locally. And this is happening. And these tools are substantially changing our ability to do a much better job of finding eligible patient for all the required characteristics. In fact, when we do things, we tune all of our models to avoid false negatives, meaning if they're eligible, find them and minimize false positives, so you're not creating more work than you had even before you were kind of using kind of some of these tools. The other part of this is find sites and investigators where there's high trust, because part of this is a social problem, right? So, you know, part of this is if I don't trust the physician who may be the lead investigator in the trial, I might not choose to participate. That's also something that you can actually use a lot of the digital infrastructure to further enable. And then post-approval, as we're going on, finding patients for eligibility almost is as difficult as it was during trials. Some of these, and I'm sure Brian kind of can speak more about diagnostic odysseys and all sorts of other characteristics on, you know, patients in rare diseases, but actually bringing this into your workflow as a routine part of how you do work actually, you know, requires a conscious effort. And this is where a lot of digital solutions, they don't have to actually be digital therapeutics in the sense of providing that therapy. They can actually be digital biomarkers deployable in the workflow to augment the decision-making of the teams, but it actually makes it possible. And I'm, you know, in case you're probably getting a positive energy off this, super optimistic, seeing tremendous progress being made. And this is something where you're finding the progress in Europe and in the United States. In fact, you know, we're seeing tremendous things occurring on the European side, which again, I'm going to blame it on the pandemic and take the gift, you know, from that area and say collaboration and cooperation there is at levels we hadn't seen in the quarter century before that, but it took off like crazy, actually, with lots of public-private interaction. So.
Thanks so much. So certainly to identify the right patients and to make sure that we're filling the gaps of the ones that were excluded from past trials and making informed decisions to help inclusion exclusion criteria for trials, that for sure, because then you're actually moving the needle to advance and whether it's diagnosis, prevention, or
absolutely
care, or in the monitoring of it.
And I have to tell you, you know, we actually give grants away in this area. So we, you know, you would think we're an early stage company, right? Well, we actually have a philanthropic side of it. We give data, technology, everything else to try to fund this ourselves, because this is an area where you kind of need to proliferate a few innovations on it. So anyway, super important topic. So thank you.
Thank you. So
can I just Gigi, can I
sure.
just come in quickly? Because I mean, as I was listening to Jeff, I was just wondering how much, what Jeff and also what Brian see in terms of putting also a gender smart lens into R&D and innovation. I read recently this book, Invisible Woman by Caroline Perez, and I was actually shocked to see how much gender has actually been ignored, according to her data, in many of the R&D trials of really important disease areas like cardiovascular and so on. So is there hope that with what is out, that there is more focus on also bringing gender, which is not a minority, I guess, but has perhaps been less intentionally brought into the innovation and R&D activity? I don't know. Sorry, it begged the question when Jeff was speaking.
Yeah, I mean, from my perspective, it's not a hope. It's an expectation, and as Jeff was saying, even a regulation, right? So I can't ignore and none of us can ignore the legacy, the history. Reasons don't need to dive into those today, but looking ahead, yes, this needs to be taken into account much more early and thoughtfully as we move medicines forward in 20s and 2030s and beyond.
So we are actually, I could learn from all three of you for hours and hours and hours. So with just a few minutes left in the program, we've got one question I'll take, and that because there's a number, and we'll of course follow up in a webinar after, or to get back to others' questions. But innovation is risky because it might not work, was one of the questions we got in. And so even if it does work as intended, there's competition. So how are VCs accommodating market risk in a Me Too industry? Is one of the questions we received. So whoever wants to take the first and last question.
I'll go ahead and it was sort of intended for, or it was a question to VCs. So I'm not quite in the right position to answer it, but I would say that there is very little room anymore for Me Too's. The shift in the industry from what used to be looking for the probability of success for regulatory approval, that is necessary but no longer sufficient. And this isn't new. It is now the reimbursement acceptance that is what we all need to be paying attention to. That means we have medically meaningful differentiation. Now, there's a lot of work to convince everybody that that's the case. It's hard to run a clinical trial that's efficient, that allows you to nail that on day one. But it's working with not only the regulatory authorities, but the payers to make sure that that risk that was taken and the benefit that it brings to patients is understood and can be demonstrated. If not on day one, then on day 1,001 or whatever it ends up being. So that, at least from my perspective.
Thanks so much. So in the interest of time, I have to move towards the closing of the program. So we're just wanted to express a big thank you to panel 2, but also everyone, that our sponsors, our speakers, our participants, the extended FABS team, the French American Biotech Springboard, that have come together to make this happen. And so all of you that have paused from busyness of work and life, I hope that we all hope that everyone has learned something or makes a new contact as a result of this program. And thanks to EY and the appropriate copyright permissions from Arda. There's some of those reports that Jim mentioned are available to anyone that's participated in this program. And we hope that FACCNE has offered some knowledge and education, and that you follow us with future events. For example, a special event in the first half of next year where we're going to highlight some of the health innovation and initiatives coming and happening in France. Thank you all for your time today, and we look forward to those of you that will be participating in our evening reception. And Jim, any other thoughts and closing remarks from your lens? And
I wanted to thank the sponsors again. We really appreciate the support that you provide for us, as well as the FACCNE. I want to mention specifically Ludivine, who is always behind the scenes, but is always exceptional, and we would be nowhere without her. So Ludivine, merci beaucoup énormément, comme d'habitude. And as well as the panelists, all the panelists, thank you for your time. It was most informative, really super interesting. I love hearing these topics. Again, we could go on and on forever with this stuff because it's absolutely fascinating. And Laure, where are you? If you're going to join us again. And again, for everyone who took time out of their day to listen, I think it's we greatly appreciate that, and hope that we were able to provide some meaningful content.
We'll be following up.
Yeah.
The questions. So
yes, we have not ignored your questions.
Yeah. Thank you.
thank you all.
Okay, merci tout le monde. Thank you, everyone.
À bientôt.
Bye.
Yeah, à bientôt.
Au revoir.